At a time when raw horsepower was worshipped and small cars were dismissed as toys, one tiny machine quietly rewrote the rules. The 1930 Austin 7, barely pushing 18 horsepower, became an unexpected disruptor in a sport dominated by bigger, louder, and supposedly superior machines. Critics mocked it, rivals underestimated it, and spectators barely gave it a second glance, until it started doing the unthinkable. Somehow, this lightweight underdog began embarrassing cars with more than triple its power, forcing drivers and engineers to question everything they thought they knew about performance. The impossible climb. It's 1930 at Shelley, Walsh, the holiest of holies for British hill climbing, where a narrow, terrified strip of tarmac winds up through the Worcestershire countryside. The air is thick, literally choking with the smell of burnt rubber, methanol, and that sweet, sickly scent of castrol R oil, while the ground itself vibrates from the passage of giants. A 4.5-liter Bentley blower has just thundered past, tearing up the asphalt with enough torque to pull a tree stump out of the ground, followed closely by a Bugatti Type 35 screaming its high-pitched French symphony. The crowd is leaning in, buzzing on adrenaline, waiting for the next titan of motorsport to assault the hill. But the thunderous roar is suddenly replaced by something altogether more confusing. The frantic, high-pitched buzz of an angry sewing machine. Around the bottom corner comes a bathtub sitting on wheels that look like they were stolen off a bicycle. It is the Austin 7, the baby Austin, a car designed specifically for vicars and nurses to drive to the post office, standing as the most sensible and utilitarian object in the United Kingdom. With a wheelbase so short you could park it in a hallway, it sits at the start line dwarfed by the ruts left by the Bugattis, looking for all the world like the driver took a wrong turn on the way to the grocery store. However, when the flag drops, the laughter dies instantly because that little bathtub doesn't just accelerate. It explodes off the line, scampering up the hill like a scalded cat. It hits the corners and, instead of slowing down, it skips and hops, fighting the road and drifting sideways on tires no wider than a palm, eventually crossing the finish line in a time that makes the Bentley owners check their stopwatches in a cold sweat. The program lists this car as having 18 horsepower, a number that sounds like a rounding error in the world of 1930s motorsport, where the competition was chasing 150 or 200 horsepower. To the modern ear, 18 horsepower sounds pathetic, less than a kitchen blender or a ride-on lawnmower. Yet this figure was enough to shock the entire racing establishment. We have all been trained by marketing departments and spec sheets to believe that horsepower is the only metric that matters, obsessing over peak figures on dyno sheets, but the Austin 7's dominance at Shelley Walsh proved that horsepower is vanity. The only truth in racing is physics, and the magic of the Austin 7 wasn't in the engine's power, but in the vehicle's sheer lack of mass. A standard Austin 7 weighed approximately 375 kilograms, roughly 820 pounds, which is essentially nothing, a rounding error on the scale of a modern vehicle. When you take a platform that light and apply even a mild tune, pushing the stock 10.5 brake horsepower up to that shocking 18 or 24 horsepower, you aren't just making the car marginally faster. You are fundamentally altering the math of the universe. This drastic shift in the power-to-weight ratio allows the car to punch so far above its weight class that it practically qualifies as a weapon. This is how a car that wheezed its way up the hill in 89.9 seconds in 1922 evolved to smash the ascent in a blistering 40.56 seconds by 1939. That isn't just improvement, it is a violation of the laws of nature, and it demands that we stop looking at the spec sheet and start understanding how a tax-dodge economy car became the most violent, successful, and unlikely giant killer in history. Bureaucracy created a racing legend. It is critical to understand that the Austin 7 was never supposed to be a racing car. If you look at the intent behind its creation, you find that it was built to solve a problem that had nothing to do with speed and everything to do with money. The car was born from a post-World War I regulatory environment that was stifling the British automotive industry. The villain of this story is a piece of legislation known as the RAC horsepower tax formula. This fiscal policy was a blunt instrument that calculated tax based on the diameter of the engine's cylinders, or the bore, rather than the actual power the engine produced. It was a bureaucratic loophole that punished large engines and inadvertently forced engineers to get creative. To dodge the taxman, manufacturers had to design engines with tiny, narrow cylinders and incredibly long strokes. It was an engineering choice dictated not by physics, but by the wallet. Sir Herbert Austin saw this regulatory landscape not as a limitation, but as a massive opportunity. He responded with the 747cc side valve engine, a power plant designed specifically to slide into the lowest possible taxation bracket. His goal was to create the British equivalent of the Model T Ford, a vehicle that would democratize travel and put the entire nation on wheels. He succeeded beyond anyone's wildest imagination. The Austin 7 didn't just sell, it saturated the market. With nearly 290,000 units produced, it became the backbone of British motoring. It was the car you learned to drive in, the car you went to work in, and for thousands of ambitious young mechanics, the car you eventually took apart. This sheer scale of production had a side effect that Sir Herbert likely never anticipated. By flooding the market with identical, interchangeable parts, he inadvertently created the world's greatest starter kit for motorsport. Racing is usually a rich man's game because when things break, and they always break, the cost of replacement is astronomical. But with the Austin 7, a blown engine or a snapped axle wasn't a financial tragedy. It was a trip to the local scrap merchant. The chassis and engine components were so cheap and so readily available that they became the standard currency of the amateur mechanic. You didn't race an Austin 7 because it was the most sophisticated machine on the grid. You raced it because when you inevitably crashed it into a hedge, you could afford to fix it before the next weekend. The influence of this little car was so profound that it became the genetic ancestor for the entire global automotive industry. It was such a robust and adaptable piece of engineering that companies around the world didn't bother designing their own cars. They just licensed the Austin. The very first BMW, the Dixie, was an Austin 7 wearing a German badge. In France, it was the Rosengart. In the United States, it was the American Austin. Even in Japan, the engineers who would eventually found Nissan used the Austin 7 design as the blueprint for their first automobiles. This global proliferation meant that the knowledge base for tuning and modifying these engines wasn't limited to a few factory engineers in Birmingham. It was a global conversation. So when we look at why the Austin 7 came to dominate the 750cc class, we have to look past the crankshafts and the carburetors. The real secret to its speed was its availability. It became the default platform for the special builder culture, allowing a generation of enthusiasts to experiment, fail, and improve without going bankrupt. The 750cc racing class was practically tailor-made for it, not because the rules favored the car, but because the car was the only thing that existed in high enough numbers to make a racing class viable. The Austin 7 proved that if you make a machine simple enough and cheap enough, people will inevitably find a way to make it fast. Physics favors the ultralight. The genius of the Austin 7 was not that it was powerful, but that it was effectively a motorized skeleton. The core of this vehicle was a separate A-frame style chassis that was shockingly simple. It possessed a wheelbase of only 75 inches and a track width so narrow at 46 inches that the car could almost fit inside the wheelbase of the luxury tourers it was competing against. The standard running gear was primitive, utilizing a 747cc side valve inline 4 with a long stroke of 76 mm, coupled to a 3-speed manual transmission that lacked synchromesh, meaning every gear change was a test of the driver's timing and mechanical sympathy. However, the defining characteristic of this platform was its mass, or rather, the lack of it. A race-prepared Austin 7 weighed as little as 375 kilograms. In the modern world, we add weight to cars to make them safer, quieter, and more comfortable. But in 1930, the Austin 7 was none of those things. It was a featherweight delivery system for kinetic energy. This lack of mass meant that the factory's Ulster transformation, named after the model's success in the Tourist Trophy, had an exponential effect on performance. The engineers took that wheezing 10.5 brake horsepower economy engine and applied aggressive modifications, including twin SU carburetors and high compression heads. This pushed the output to 24 brake horsepower in unblown form, and a terrifying 33 brake horsepower when fitted with a supercharger. This is where the math of enough becomes critical. If you look at a standard saloon with 10.5 horsepower hauling 432 kilograms, you are looking at a power-to-weight ratio of roughly 25 brake horsepower per ton, which is barely enough to get out of your own way. But when you take the unblown Ulster with 24 horsepower and drop the weight to 375 kilograms, that ratio jumps to 64 brake horsepower per ton. If you look at the supercharged model, it leaps again to nearly 87 brake horsepower per ton. That is a threefold increase in potential acceleration. In a car this light, that kind of jump doesn't feel like a linear progression. It feels like an explosion. This multiplier effect allowed the car to punch far above its nominal horsepower class because the engine wasn't wasting energy moving steel. Every ounce of power was converted directly into forward motion. Yet, this explosive power-to-weight ratio came with a significant catch. The Austin 7 was not a sophisticated racing chassis. It was a flexible economy frame that had been bullied into going fast. The A-frame was notoriously weak in torsion, meaning that when you applied that newfound torque, the chassis itself would twist. This flexibility, combined with the use of quarter-elliptic rear springs, created a dynamic nightmare where the rear cross member would sway sideways relative to the front of the car. This meant the car had a natural, terrifying propensity for oversteer. You weren't just driving the track. You were wrestling a chassis that was actively trying to steer the rear axle independently of the front wheels. Builders quickly learned that to survive, let alone win, they had to engineer solutions to these inherent flaws. They stiffened the chassis by box-sectioning the rails or integrating the bodywork to add rigidity. They played with tire geometry, fitting skinny tires on the front and wider, offset rubber on the rear to widen the track and tame the oversteer. The Grasshopper defied gravity. A high-speed circuit like Brooklands or Le Mans, the Austin 7 would have been terrifying for all the wrong reasons. At 100 miles an hour, its short wheelbase would make it twitchy, unstable, and likely to swap ends before you even realized you were crashing. But the genius of this car, or perhaps the happy accident of its design, was that it wasn't winning on the Mulsanne Straight. It was winning at places like Shelley Walsh. Hill climbing is a very specific, violent genre of motorsport. It is not about sustained speed or aerodynamic efficiency. It is a knife fight in a phone booth. The courses are defined by short, brutal gradients and incredibly tight hairpin turns, where high-end horsepower figures are useless if you can't put the power to the ground. In this environment, the massive lumbering giants like the Bentleys were at a distinct disadvantage. They had the power, but they also had the momentum of a freight train. The Austin 7, with its minuscule 75-inch wheelbase, was inherently agile. It didn't need to brake early, it just needed to turn. However, calling the handling good would be a lie. The car earned the nickname Grasshopper, a moniker coined by Lord Austin's own aide, Bill Sewell. And it wasn't a term of endearment. It was a warning. The nickname referenced the car's nasty habit of literally hopping under hard acceleration. The transmission of power from that torquey little engine to the live rear axle, combined with the flexible chassis and quarter-elliptic springs, meant that when you mashed the throttle, the rear wheels would often fight for traction, juddering and skipping across the tarmac rather than gripping it. This dynamic flaw meant that driving an Austin 7 fast was less about steering and more about damage control. The frame allowed the rear axle to steer independently of the front, creating a sensation that the car was trying to crab walk sideways off the cliff. To combat this, the builders had to resort to what looked like mechanical alchemy. They realized that standard tire pressures were suicide, so they dropped them. They didn't just lower them, they ran them at pressures so low, sometimes below 3 psi, that the tires looked flat. This maximized the contact patch, turning the tire into a gummy claw that could grapple with the road surface and absorb the violence of the launch. But soft tires weren't enough to tame the Grasshopper. The serious competitors had to redesign the suspension geometry entirely. They abandoned the stock setup and welded in radius rods and panhard rods, steel bars designed to physically lock the axle in place and prevent it from wandering sideways. This was the moment the Austin 7 stopped being an economy car and started being a race car. It forced the drivers to become engineers, to diagnose the dynamic failures of the platform, and fabricate solutions in their sheds. And the proof that these desperate fixes worked is written in the record books. In 1922, a factory entry wheezed its way up the hill in 89.9 seconds. By 1939, Burt Hadley took a supercharged version up the same piece of tarmac in 40.56 seconds. That isn't just a marginal gain, that is the difference between a horse-drawn carriage and a fighter jet, proving that this wobbly, hopping chassis was capable of absorbing an infinite amount of development if you had the nerve to tame it. Legends built from scrap metal. While the factory team was busy proving the reliability of the Austin 7, with victories at events like the inaugural Australian Grand Prix and the Double 12 endurance race, a far more interesting subculture was bubbling up in the garden sheds of Great Britain. The true legacy of the Austin 7 is not found in the trophy cabinets of the Austin Motor Company, but in the grease-stained hands of the amateur mechanics who hacked, sawed, and welded these cars into something unrecognizable. The Austin 7 became the most modified vehicle in human history simply because it was the only thing a normal person could afford to break. This accessibility birthed the special builder phenomenon, formalized by the 750 Motor Club, which essentially encouraged people to drag these chassis out of scrapyards and turn them into racing cars. It was a movement that treated the Austin 7 not as a finished product, but as a blank canvas made of cheap steel, creating a chaotic environment where the only limit was your imagination and your willingness to ignore safety regulations. This chaotic environment served as the unofficial university of motorsport, educating the very men who would go on to define Formula One engineering in the latter half of the 20th century. If you look closely at the history of the sport, you realize that without the humble Austin 7, the modern grid would look completely different. Colin Chapman, the genius founder of Lotus Cars, who revolutionized racing with his obsession for lightweight structures, did not start his career in a high-tech wind tunnel. He started as a university student, modifying an old 1930 Austin 7. He stripped it down, tuned the engine, and built his own bodywork, learning the fundamental lesson that would define the Lotus philosophy. If you add power, you get faster on the straights, but if you subtract weight, you get faster everywhere. Similarly, Bruce McLaren, the name behind one of the most successful teams in F1 history, cut his teeth restoring and racing an Austin 7 Ulster in hill climbs. These legends learned how to manipulate suspension geometry and manage power-to-weight ratios on this crude little chassis, proving that the Austin 7 was effectively the kindergarten for the greatest minds in automotive history. However, the evolution of the Austin 7 didn't stop at lightweight bodywork and amateur tinkering. It entered a terrifying new phase with the introduction of forced induction. The factory and privateers realized that, to stay competitive against the MG midgets, they needed to shove more air into the engine than the atmosphere could provide. They bolted on Cosette vane-type superchargers, gear-driven from the front of the engine, transforming the character of the car from a peppy runabout into a screaming mechanical banshee. The factory super sports models were pushing out 33 brake horsepower at 5,000 revolutions per minute. While that number still sounds low to modern ears, you have to look at the specific output. They were extracting 44 horsepower per liter from a side valve engine designed in the early 1920s. That is a specific output increase of over 200% compared to the stock engine, a level of tuning that borders on mechanical cruelty. This pursuit of power turned the engines into what mechanics affectionately called grenades. The original components were simply not designed to handle the thermal and physical stress of supercharging. The standard crankshaft, a spindly piece of metal often compared to a bent wire, would frequently surrender under the increased load, snapping in half and turning the engine block into a container for expensive shrapnel. This forced an engineering arms race where failure was the primary teacher. Specialist firms like Laystall Engineering had to step in to manufacture heavy-duty, pressure-fed crankshafts capable of surviving the violence of a supercharged combustion cycle. Privateers began casting their own cylinder blocks and redesigning the lubrication systems because the stock splash feed oiling was completely inadequate for an engine spinning at 5,000 revolutions per minute. Driving a supercharged Austin 7 at those speeds, with cable brakes and a chassis that flexed like a recurve bow, required a level of bravery that borders on insanity, cementing the car's reputation as a machine that demanded total commitment from its driver. The school of going fast. The most enduring legacy of the Austin 7 is not the trophy sitting in a factory cabinet, but the movement it sparked in the garden sheds of Great Britain. While the factory teams were pushing the limits with superchargers, a grassroots phenomenon known as the special builder culture was taking root, fundamentally changing the landscape of motorsport. The Austin 7 was cheap, simple, and available in massive numbers, making it the perfect donor vehicle for amateur mechanics who couldn't afford a Bugatti, but possessed a hacksaw and a dream. This wasn't just a hobby, it was an obsession formalized by the creation of the 750 Motor Club, which introduced the unblown 750 formula to encourage affordable racing. These builders would drag a chassis out of a scrapyard, strip it down to the bare metal, and build something entirely new, often creating machines that looked like they belonged in a science fiction novel rather than on a public road. You see examples like the White Rabbit race car, which Marcus Chambers built from the burnt remains of another vehicle, proving that even fire couldn't kill the potential of this platform. Then you have the engineering extremes like the Appleton Special, a car that pushed the boundaries of what was physically possible with a side valve engine. By 1937, the Appleton Special was estimating a specific output of 166 brake horsepower per liter. To put that in perspective, that is a higher specific output than many high-performance engines produced 80 years later. These weren't just fast cars, they were rolling laboratories where the limits of specific output were tested until the metal literally gave up. This culture of backyard engineering served as the unofficial university for the titans of post-war motorsport. If you trace the lineage of Formula One, you eventually end up looking at an Austin 7. Colin Chapman, the founder of Lotus Cars, and the man who revolutionized racing with his philosophy of lightweight construction, didn't start with a wind tunnel. He started with a 1930 Austin 7. He built the Lotus Mark I Trials car from an old 7 chassis, while he was still a student, learning the critical lesson that removing weight is just as effective as adding power. Bruce McLaren, the name behind the legendary McLaren racing team, cut his teeth restoring and racing an Austin 7 Ulster in hill climbs. Eric Broadley of Lola and Tony Southgate also started here. The Austin 7 was the machine that taught the world's greatest designers how to weld, how to tune, and most importantly, how to solve the problem of making a flexible, flawed chassis go faster than it had any right to. So, when we look back at the crowd standing at Shelley Walsh in the 1930s, staring in disbelief as a tiny car stormed the hill, we have to understand what they were actually seeing. They weren't just shocked by the speed, they were witnessing a paradigm shift. The Austin 7 proved that you didn't need a 12-cylinder engine, a royal title, or a trust fund to go fast. It proved that 18 horsepower, when packaged in a chassis that weighed less than a grand piano, was enough to humiliate the giants of the industry. The success of the Austin 7 was a victory for the power-to-weight ratio, a concept that it demonstrated with such violence that it could no longer be ignored. The 1930 Austin 7 is the definitive light car because it democratized performance. It took the exclusive world of motorsport and handed the keys to anyone with a socket set and a total lack of self-preservation. It was a vehicle that demanded you fix its flaws, stiffen its frame, and tame its suspension. And in doing so, it created a generation of engineers who would go on to conquer the world. The shock at the hill climbs wasn't magic. It was the inevitable result of adaptability, aggressive weight reduction, and the absolute refusal to accept that a small engine meant a slow car. This humble economy vehicle didn't just mobilize a nation, it taught the world how to race.